view. Slightly perilous, perhaps, but still he thought it rather neat. "Oh," she said, "you see, I've been so much out of England. We were just talking about holidays. I was saying to Mrs. Cotterill that they certainly ought to go to Switzerland this year for a change." "Yes, Mrs. Capron Smith was just saying," Mrs. Cotterill put in. So that was her name. "It would be something too lovely," said Nellie in ecstasy. Switzerland! Astonishing how with a single word she had marked the gulf between Bursley people and herself. The Cotterills had never been out of England. Not merely that, but the Cotterills had never dreamt of going out of England. Denry had once been to Dieppe, and had come back as though from Timbuctoo with a traveller's renown. And she talked of Switzerland easily. "I suppose it's very jolly," he said. "Yes," she said. "It's splendid in summer. But of course the time is winter for the sports. Naturally, when you aren't free to take a bit of holiday in winter, you must be content with summer. And very splendid it is. I'm sure you'd enjoy it frightfully, Nell." "I'm sure I should, frightfully," Nellie agreed. "I shall speak to father. I shall make him..." "Now, Nellie," her mother warned her. "Yes, I shall, mother," Nellie insisted. "There is your father," observed Mrs. Cotterill, after listening. Footsteps crossed the hall and died away into the dining room. "I wonder why on earth father doesn't come in here. He must have heard us talking," said Nellie, like a tyrant crossed in some trifle. A bell rang, and then the servant came into the drawing room and remarked, "If you please, mum," at Mrs. Cotterill, and Mrs. Cotterill disappeared, closing the door after her. "What are they up to between them?" Nellie demanded, and she too departed, with wrinkled brow, leaving Denry and Ruth together. It could be perceived on Nellie's brow that her father was going to "catch it." "I haven't seen Mr. Cotterill yet," said Mrs. Capron Smith. "When did you come?" Denry asked. "Only this afternoon." She continued to talk. As he looked at her, listening and responding intelligently now and then, he saw that Mrs. Capron Smith was, in truth, the woman that Ruth had so cleverly imitated 10 years before. The imitation had deceived him then. He had accepted it for genuine. It would not have deceived him now. He knew that. Oh yes! This was the real article that could hold its own anywhere. Switzerland! And not simply Switzerland, but a refinement on Switzerland. Switzerland in winter. He divined that, in her opinion, Switzerland in summer was not worth doing, in the way of correctness. But in winter... II Nellie had announced a surprise for Denry as he entered the house. But Nellie's surprise for Denry, startling and successful though it proved, was as naught to the surprise which Mr. Cotterill had in hand for Nellie, her mother, Denry, the town of Bursley, and various persons up and down the country. Mrs. Cotterill came hysterically in upon the duologue between Denry and Ruth in the drawing room. From the activity of her hands, which, instead of being decently folded one over the other, were waving round her head in the strangest way, it was clear that Mrs. Cotterill was indeed under the stress of a very unusual emotion. "It's those creditors at last! I knew it would be! It's all those creditors! They won't let him alone, and now they've done it!" So Mrs. Cotterill. She dropped into a chair. She no longer had any sense of shame, of what was due to her dignity. She seemed to have forgotten that certain matters are not proper to be discussed in drawing rooms. She had left the room Mrs. Councillor Cotterill. She had returned to it nobody in particular, the personification of defeat. The change had operated in about 5 minutes. Mrs. Capron Smith and Denry glanced at each other, and even Mrs. Capron Smith was at a loss for a moment. Then Ruth approached Mrs. Cotterill and took her hand. Perhaps Mrs. Capron Smith was not so astonished after all. She and Nellie's mother had always been very friendly, and in the Five Towns very friendly means a lot. "Perhaps if you were to leave us," Ruth suggested, twisting her head to glance at Denry. It was exactly what he desired to do. There could be no doubt that Ruth was supremely a woman of the world. Her tact was faultless. He left them, saying to himself: "Well, here's a go!" In the hall, through an open door, he saw Councillor Cotterill standing against the dining-room mantelpiece. When Cotterill caught sight of Denry, he straightened himself into a certain uneasy perkiness. "Young man," he said, in a counterfeit of his old patronising tone, "come in here. You might as well hear about it. You're a friend of ours. Come in and shut the door." Nellie was not in view. Denry went in and shut the door. "Sit down," said Cotterill. And it was just as if he had said: "Now, you're a fairly bright sort of youth, and you haven't done so badly in life, and as a reward I mean to admit you to the privilege of hearing about our ill luck, which, for some mysterious reason, reflects more credit on me than your good luck reflects on you, young man." And he stroked his straggling grey beard. "I'm going to file my petition to morrow," said he, and gave a short laugh. "Really?" said Denry, who could think of nothing else to say. His name was not Capron Smith. "Yes, they won't leave me any alternative," said Mr Cotterill. Then he gave a brief history of his late commercial career to the young man, and he seemed to figure it as a sort of tug of war between his creditors and his debtors, he himself being the rope. He seemed to imply that he had always done his sincere best to attain the greatest good of the greatest number, but that those wrong-headed creditors had consistently thwarted him. However, he bore them no grudge. It was the fortune of the tug of war. He pretended, with shabby magnificence of spirit, that a bankruptcy, at the age of near 60, in a community where one has cut a figure, is a mere passing episode. "Are you surprised?" he asked, foolishly, with a sheepish smile. Denry took vengeance for all the patronage that he had received during a decade. "No," he said. "Are you?" Instead of kicking Denry out of the house for an impudent young jackanapes, Mr Cotterill simply resumed his sheepish smile. Denry had been surprised for a moment, but he had quickly recovered. Cotterill's downfall was one of those events which any person of acute intelligence can foretell after they have happened. Cotterill had run the risks of a speculative builder, built and mortgaged, sold at a profit, sold without profit, sold at a loss and failed to sell, given bills, second mortgages and third mortgages. And because he was a builder, and could do nothing but build, he had continued to build, in defiance of Bursley's lack of enthusiasm for his erections. If rich gold deposits had been discovered in Bursley Municipal Park, Cotterill would have owned a mining camp and amassed immense wealth. But unfortunately gold deposits were not discovered in the park. Nobody knew his position. Nobody ever does know the position of a speculative builder. He did not know it himself. There had been rumours, but they had been contradicted in an adequate way. His recent refusal of the mayoral chain, due to lack of spare coin, had been attributed to prudence. His domestic existence had always been conducted on the same moderately lavish scale. He had always paid the baker, the butcher, the tailor, the dressmaker. And now he was to file his petition in bankruptcy, and to morrow the entire town would have been seeing it coming for years. "What shall you do?" Denry inquired, in amicable curiosity. "Well," said Cotterill, "that's the point. I've got a brother, a builder in Toronto, you know. He's doing very well. Building is building over there. I wrote to him a bit since, and he replied by the next mail, that what he wanted was just a man like me to overlook things. He's getting an old man now, is John. So you see there's an opening waiting for me." As if to say, the righteous are never forsaken. "I tell you all this as you're a friend of the family, like," he added. Then, after an expanse of vagueness, he began, hopefully, cheerfully, undauntedly: "Even now, if I could get hold of a couple of thousand, I could pull through handsome. And there's plenty of security for it." "Bit late now, isn't it?" "Not it. If only someone who really knows the town, and has faith in the property market, would come down with a couple of thousand, well, he might double it in 5 years." "Really?" "Yes," said Cotterill. "Look at Clare Street." Clare Street was one of his terra cotta masterpieces. "You, now," said Cotterill, insinuating. "I don't expect anyone can teach you much about the value of property in this town. You know as well as I do.